breakups are rarely clean. Ours was more like a slow, messy amputation. After 2 years, my relationship with Ben had devolved into a tedious cycle of arguments, accusations, and long, resentful silences. It was obvious to everyone, including us, that things weren't going to work out. So when we finally called it quits, the primary emotion I felt wasn't sadness, but a profound, bone-deep relief. I did what any sensible person does in the 21st century. I blocked him on everything, a Jizutao exorcism. I drew a line, and that was that. I'm a student at Temple University, living in a small, second-floor apartment near campus. It's in one of those older brick buildings with thin walls and drafty windows, the kind of place where you become intimately familiar with your neighbors. Arguments and the city's nightly symphony of sirens and shouting. It was my sanctuary, my personal bubble in the chaotic world of college life. A few days after the breakup, the sanctity of that bubble was breached. I started hearing noises at night. Not the usual city sounds I had long since learned to tune out. These were different, quieter, more deliberate. The soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel alleyway below my window, a faint, persistent shuffling sound, like someone trying to stay hidden in the shadows. At first, I dismissed it as my post-breakup mind playing tricks on me, my heightened emotional state manifesting as paranoia. But the sounds were consistent, appearing just after midnight each night. Eventually, I came to a conclusion that, at the time, seemed logical and almost comforting. It was probably Ben now. Before you picture a terrifying stalker scenario, you need to understand Ben. He was one of the sweetest, most genuinely harmless guys I had ever met. I mean that in the nicest way possible. He was the type of person who would apologize to a table if he bumped into it. He didn't have a malicious or drastic bone in his body. So, the thought of him lurking in the alley below my window didn't really freak me out. I figured he was just heartbroken, wallowing in his sorrow, and this was his sad, pathetic way of feeling close to me. I decided to just let it go. He'd get bored eventually and move on. I had bigger things to worry about. Specifically, I had a massive group project. For my communications class, a video presentation that accounted for a huge chunk of our final grade. As the only one in my group with any real experience with Adobe Premiere Pro, the final editing and submission fell to me. I spent an entire night hunched over my laptop, meticulously cutting clips, balancing audio, and polishing every transition, until it was perfect. Just before the midnight deadline, I attached the finished file to an email, sent it to my professor, and collapsed into bed, feeling the immense relief of having it done. I closed my eyes, determined not to think about my ex-boyfriend lurking in the alleyway or anything else that was going wrong in my life. The next day, in class, my world imploded. My professor, a stern man named Dr. Albright, plugged his laptop into the lecture hall's projector. He pulled up the email I had sent, his mouse hovering over the video file. I felt a flutter of nervous pride. I knew our project was good, probably a cut above what the other groups had produced. I settled back in my seat, ready for the A then. The video started playing and my stomach didn't just drop, it plummeted into a black, icy abyss. It wasn't our project. On the massive screen at the front of the hall, a grainy, low-resolution video flickered to life. It showed a person sitting in a dimly lit room, their face completely obscured by a cheap, plastic scream mask. The figure wasn't just sitting there. They were talking, their voice digitally distorted into a low, robotic growl. And they were saying the most vile, horrific things imaginable. Disgusting, hateful things about me, personally, about my professor, about the government, laden with paranoid conspiracy theories and violent rhetoric. I can't even bring myself to repeat the words that were said. They were pure poison. Dr. Albright let the video play for what felt like an eternity, probably frozen in the same state of shock that had paralyzed the entire room. When he finally fumbled for the mouse and paused it, his face was ashen. I was frozen in my seat, unable to move, unable to breathe. I had never been so utterly publicly mortified in my entire life. I could feel hundreds of eyes on me, a physical weight of judgment and disgust. I knew what they were all thinking, that I had done this, that I was this monster. Asterisk, after the most painful 60 seconds of my life, the paralysis broke. A guttural sob tore from my throat, and I fled the lecture hall, tears streaming down my face. A full-blown panic attack was taking hold, my chest tight, my vision blurring. My first instinct was to run home and never come back, but I knew that if I just left I would be expelled without question. So, I forced myself to wait outside the building, hiding in an alcove, my body shaking uncontrollably until the class ended. Reluctantly, I approached Dr. Albright. I pleaded with him, the words tumbling out in a desperate hiccuping rush, assuring him that I had no idea what had just happened, that I was positive I had sent the correct video file. To his credit, he heard me out. He opened his email again, and we discovered the problem. 2 emails had been sent from my account. The first, sent at 11:58 p.m., contained our actual project. The second, sent at 11:59 p.m., contained the horrific video. Someone had hacked my email. Clearing my name with the university was a long, humiliating ordeal, but I was eventually able to do it. but nothing could erase the shame, the memory of my classmates' faces, the distorted, monstrous voice echoing through the lecture hall. It was clear I had a much bigger problem than academic probation. I immediately changed my email password, assuming this was some bizarre one-off act of digital vandalism. I thought I had just gotten incredibly, spectacularly unlucky. That's when things got worse. Not even a week later, I woke up, reached for my phone and opened Snapchat. I was greeted by the login screen. I had been logged out. That only happens when someone else logs into your account from a different device. The cold dread returned, tenfold. My Snapchat had been hacked. I don't even want to think about what they found on there. There were years of my life in my Snapchat memories, private conversations, photos, and videos I never intended for anyone else to see. The kind of stuff I don't feel comfortable talking about, even now. This time, I went straight to the police. I told them everything, the noises, the hacked email, and now this. The obvious suspect was Ben. To my surprise, when the police contacted him, he agreed to be questioned without hesitation. The investigation confirmed he wasn't behind the hacking. His alibi was solid, and he had no technical skills to speak of. But he did admit to something else. In a fit of post-breakup anger, he had posted my personal information, my name, my university, links to my social media profiles on some obscure, dark corner of the internet, an online forum known for harassment. He swore he never posted any of my past words, but he didn't have to. Like an absolute idiot, I used the same simple, easy-to-guess password for everything. The police told me there wasn't much they could do. Ben hadn't technically broken the law in a way they could prosecute, and he wasn't responsible for the hacking itself. The full gravity of the situation finally crashed down on me. Some anonymous stranger from a hate-filled online forum now had my email, my Snapchat, and God knows what else. They had a treasure trove of my most private moments. They could blackmail me. They could ruin my life. I changed every single password I had, creating complex randomized strings of characters. But the damage was already done. It was too late. A few weeks went by in a state of hypervigilant terror. Nothing happened. I started to allow myself a sliver of hope. Maybe whoever was tormenting me saw that I had gotten the police involved and decided I wasn't worth the risk. Maybe they had gotten scared and backed off. I thought it was finally over. Of course, at WASN, single quotes T. One day I got a notification. A random username had added me on Snapchat. This wasn't too unusual. It happened from time to time. Without thinking, I accepted the request. A second later, a new chat message appeared. I opened it. It was a picture of me. It was one of the private photos from my Snapchat memories. My heart stopped. Before I could even react, another one came through. And another. I blocked them, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hit the button. They were about to threaten me. I was sure of it. I burst into tears, a wave of helplessness and violation washing over me. I had never felt so powerless in my life. For the next week, a new random profile would add me on Snapchat every single day. I knew it was the same person, a relentless, faceless tormentor. I never accepted their requests, terrified of what they would say, what they would demand. This has been ongoing for what feels like an eternity now. I don't know what to do. There is no evidence, no way to track this person. The police can't get involved without a direct threat, and even then, what could they do? It's a digital ghost. The worst part, the part that keeps me awake at night, is that they know everything. Through the information Ben posted and what they found on my accounts, they know my address, they know where I lived. They have already lurked outside my apartment. The noises I heard in the beginning weren't Ben's pathetic attempts at connection. It was them. It was always them. I am terrified that if I keep ignoring their Snapchat requests, they'll get frustrated. They'll do something drastic. They have already breached my digital life, and I fear it's only a matter of time before they breach my physical one. Last night I couldn't take it anymore. The constant notifications, the fear, the not knowing. I made a new Snapchat account, added one of the usernames that had tried to add me, and sent a simple message. What do you want? The reply came instantly. It wasn't text. It was a picture. It was a photo of the back of my head, my hair illuminated by the glow of my laptop screen. It was taken from inside my apartment. From the dark corner of my living room, my phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered to the floor. And from the shadows behind me, I heard the soft, deliberate creak of a floorboard. The ghost wasn't just digital anymore. It was in the room with me. Graduate school, I was quickly learning, was a unique brand of monastic solitude. As a civil engineering student at Purdue, my life had become a predictable rhythm of lectures, lab work, and late-night study sessions. I was starting to find my footing a few months into the program. All things considered, I was in a good place. The classes were challenging but manageable. I'd made a couple of friends in my cohort, and the apartment I'd found, while a considerable drive from campus, was a rare gem of affordability in a sea of inflated student housing. The only real downside was the landlord, a greasy, shifty man named Mr. Henderson, who communicated in grunts and always seemed to be looking at a point just over my shoulder. And of course, there was the neighborhood. It was a sketchy part of town, the kind of place where you didn't leave valuables in your car and walked a little faster after dark. But I was a guy in my mid-20s, reasonably fit and naively confident in my ability to handle myself. Besides, I wasn't there to party or soak up the local culture. I was there for a degree. A little boredom, a little grit was all part of the process. Everything was humming along in its mundane, predictable way until the day my world tilted on its axis. It happened on a Tuesday. I was in a lecture hall I rarely used, a vast anonymous space in a building on the far side of campus. I had to use the bathroom and, in a moment of staggering stupidity, I left my backpack sitting on the table. I was gone for maybe 3 minutes, tops. When I got back, it was gone. Just an empty space where my entire academic and personal life that had been sitting moments before. My heart sank. I frantically searched the immediate area, hoping it was a misplaced prank, but I knew it was gone. Of course, this being my luck, the lecture hall was one of the few on campus without security cameras. There was nothing to be done. The campus police took a report with an air of bored resignation that told me my backpack was already a loss, cause I was more annoyed than scared at first. My wallet, laptop, and keys were in that bag. The next 24 hours were a bureaucratic nightmare of canceling credit cards, filing for a new driver's license, reporting my apartment keys, missing to a particularly unhelpful Mr. Henderson, and trying to figure out how to afford a new laptop on a grad student's budget. It was a massive, expensive headache, but things happen. You deal with it and move on, or so I thought. It wasn't until a few days later on a cold Friday evening that I realized my situation was infinitely worse than a simple theft. I drove home from a long day of classes, my mind numb with fatigue, and found a small folded piece of paper slipped under my apartment door. I assumed it was a notice from Henderson, probably a passive-aggressive reminder about rent or some obscure building policy. I picked it up, unlocked my door, and unfolded it under the harsh light of my kitchen. The note contained only 3 words, written in a cramped, spidery script. I see you. There was no name, no signature, just those 3 words. They hung in the air, charged with a sudden, terrifying energy. My blood ran cold. The annoyance I had felt over my stolen backpack was instantly replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching fear. It wasn't a random theft. Whoever took my bag hadn't just pawned my laptop for a quick buck. They had gone through it. They had found my address, probably from a utility bill or a saved document. They knew where I lived. That thought was terrifying enough, but it was immediately eclipsed by another, far more horrifying realization that hit me like a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. Whoever had my backpack had my keys. My skin began to itch. The familiar, safe space of my apartment suddenly felt alien and menacing. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows of my own living room. I lunged for the door, slammed it shut, and threw the deadbolt. The solid thunk of the lock was a small, temporary comfort in a world that had suddenly become hostile and threatening. The deadbolt, even if they had my key, they couldn't get past the deadbolt. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, a desperate prayer against the encroaching darkness. Over the next week, the notes continued. They appeared every other day, always slipped silently under my door while I was at class. They were all handwritten, all in the same spidery script. They were never long, just short, cryptic phrases that seemed designed to burrow into my psyche and fester. I know what you did. Watch yourself. You're not as smart as you think. At that point, it was really starting to freak me out. I'm a good person. I've never really done anything wrong. But if someone had meticulously combed through the digital detritus of my life on my laptop, my browser history, my private messages, my half-finished creative writing projects, who knows what kind of twisted narrative they could construct? What innocuous detail could they twist into something sinister? I felt exposed, violated in a way that was far more intimate than a simple theft. I considered going to the police, but what could I tell them? That someone was leaving me mean notes. I imagined the bored, dismissive look on the officer's face. I decided to wait it out, clinging to the hope that this was just some twisted game, and that my tormentor would eventually get bored and move on. The apathetic hope was shattered one night. I was getting ready for bed, going through the familiar motions of brushing my teeth and setting my alarm. It was dark outside, and my blinds were half closed, angled just enough to let in slivers of the orange glow from the streetlights below. As I turned off my bedroom light, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. It was a flash, a distinct, unmistakable flash, like the quick, predatory blink of a camera's shutter. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I lunged for the window and yanked the blinds completely shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peered through a tiny crack, my breath fogging the cold glass. There was no one there, just an empty street and the whispering trees. Was I imagining things? Was the paranoia finally starting to make me see things that weren't there? The psychological torment soon escalated to a physical one. I started noticing small things around my apartment. tiny inconsistencies that pricked at the edges of my sanity. Things were being moved. At first it was subtle enough that I could dismiss it as my own carelessness. My running shoes, which I always left by the door, would be tucked neatly under my bed. My coat, which I always hung in the closet, would be draped over a kitchen chair. My favorite coffee mug would be in a different cabinet. They were little things, Isley explained. Away if I tried hard enough. He's stressed, he's forgetful. But a cold knot of certainty was tightening in my stomach. Someone was coming into my apartment when I was gone. They were using my key. They were walking through my space, touching my things, and leaving these small, deliberate markers of their presence, a quiet assertion of their power over me. Then, one afternoon, I came home to find any semblance of plausible deniability utterly destroyed. I opened my apartment door and stopped dead. The place had been turned upside down, but it wasn't a robbery. Nothing was broken. It was meticulous. My bed sheets had been stripped off and folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. My dresser drawers were all pulled out, their contents not thrown about, but carefully placed in strange, unsettling piles on the floor. My books had been pulled from their shelves and arranged in a perfect, spiraling pattern across my living room rug. It was the work of a disturbed, methodical mind. It was a message. I can do whatever I want here. I finally called the cops. They came, they looked around, they took notes, but their conclusion was the same one I had feared. No forced entry, nothing reported stolen. There wasn't much they could do. They advised me to talk to my landlord about changing the locks and left, leaving me alone in my violated home. I immediately called Mr. Henderson, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. I explained the situation, the notes, the ransacked apartment, the stolen keys. I begged him to change the locks immediately. He sighed, a long weary sound of pure indifference. He said it would take at least 2 days to get a locksmith out. 2 days, I pleaded with him, trying to convey the urgency, the sheer terror I was feeling. He just shrugged it off. It's not a life or death emergency, he said, his voice flat and dismissive. I'll put it in the work order. I felt utterly, completely betrayed. How could he not understand? How could this not be an emergency? I kept calling him, leaving voicemails, sending texts, but he eventually just stopped answering. I was on my own. That was yesterday. As I write this, sitting on my floor because I can't bring myself to touch the neatly folded sheets on my bed, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I barely slept last night, every creak of the old building sending a fresh jolt of adrenaline through my veins. The deadbolt is my only friend, my only shield. I thought about changing the locks myself, but I'm not handy, and I'm terrified of causing expensive damage that Henderson would inevitably pin on me. I called out of all my classes this morning. The thought of leaving my apartment empty, of leaving it vulnerable to another invasion, is more than I can bear. I'm afraid to leave, but I'm also afraid to stay. I'm sitting here, writing all this down, trying to make sense of the senseless, and a plan, born of desperation and terror, is beginning to form in my mind. If they went through my laptop, they know my schedule. They know I should be in a thermodynamics seminar right now. They think the apartment is empty, so I'm not going to run. I'm not going to hide. I'm going to wait. I'm going to hide in the deep closet in the hallway, armed with the heaviest textbook I own, and I'm going to get the jump on them. I am going to confront whoever is doing this. I am going to see their face. Update: I'm writing this from a hospital bed. My hand is broken and I think a couple of my ribs are cracked, but I'm alive. I did it. I hid in the closet. The door cracked just enough to see the front door. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my own breathing deafeningly loud in the silence. And then I heard it. The soft, metallic scrape of a key in the lock. The door swung open and a figure stepped inside. It was Mr. Henderson. He didn't look around. He walked in with an air of ownership, a faint smug smile on his face. He strolled into the living room, looked at the spiraling books on the floor, and let out a small, satisfied chuckle. I don't know what came over me. It wasn't bravery. It was pure, unadulterated rage. I burst out of the closet screaming and swung the heavy engineering textbook with all my might. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening thud. He staggered, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He was bigger than me, but I was fueled by weeks of terror. We fought. It was a clumsy, brutal struggle. He was strong, his hands like vices, but I was feral. In the end, I managed to shove him hard enough that he stumbled backward, tripping over one of the piles of my clothes and hitting his head on the corner of my coffee table. The police said, he's been doing this for years. He had a box of keys from former tenants and a collection of stolen items he used to learn about their lives. It was a game to him, a sick, twisted power trip where he played God with the lives of the people who trusted him with their safety. He's in custody now. The locks are changed, but I can't stay here. Every time I close my eyes, I see his smug face as he walked into my home. I see the look of shock when I fought back. The police called me lucky, but I don't feel lucky. I feel broken. I won the battle, but I'm not sure if I'll ever feel safe again. College was, for me, a masterclass in invisibility. I wasn't the guy who aced every exam, nor the one who lived and breathed the Greek letter life of a fraternity. I didn't have a steady girlfriend to spend my weekends with, and my name wasn't on the roster of any clubs or teams. I was just there, a ghost haunting the back rows of lecture halls, a background character in someone else's vibrant university experience. Looking back, it sounds pathetic, but truthfully, my life now is anything but. In my late 30s, I found a woman who fights for me with a loyalty I never knew existed, and our quiet life with our 2 cats, Blue and Raz, is a universe away from that lonely kid. I'm even planning to propose. So no, I'm not complaining. But back then, the lack of a frat affiliation meant that the quintessential college experience, the sprawling, chaotic, bass-thumping house party, was an exclusive club I wasn't invited to. My circle of equally invisible friends, Bryson and Ian, felt the same gnawing desire for a weekend that didn't dissolve into the stale air of Bryson's dorm room. We were perpetually on the outside looking in, hungry for any scrap of social excitement that fell our way. This desperation led us on some truly questionable quests for a good time, including a memorable 2-hour round trip for a party that turned out to be little more than a dozen people huddled around a dying keg. We were, to put it mildly, desperate, though. When Eon's group chat message pinged on that particularly bleak Friday afternoon, it felt like a lifeline. The girl he was currently and precariously talking to had given him an address, a party not too far from campus, a real one. Bryson, ever the cynic, immediately fired back a joke about Ian's penchant for attracting the strangest women. I swear if this is some death metal emo anime convention, I'm leaving you there, he typed, a sentiment I silently co-signed. Ian's taste was eclectic, but he was insistent, almost pleading. He swore this one was different, that it would be a normal party. Normal, we didn't have anything better to do, a recurring theme in our lives, so we relented to complete our sad little troupe. Bryson roped his older brother Chris into being our designated driver. Chris was a unicorn in the college world. He didn't drink and seemed genuinely content with his sobriety. He was down for the adventure, and just like that, everything was set. The plan was in motion. The drive there, however, was where the first thread of the night began to unravel. Ian, hunched in the back seat, started his familiar lament about the girl, whose name was Callista. She hadn't replied to his texts in hours. For anyone who knew Ian, this wasn't exactly a shocking development. He had a tendency to come on too strong, a tidal wave of neediness that often sent girls running for higher ground. But this time felt different. He was genuinely distraught, his voice tight with anxiety. He started muttering about having second thoughts, that maybe we should just turn back. It was a dramatic overreaction, even for him. We were already half an hour into the drive, the suburbs melting into unfamiliar, darker countryside. Turning back wasn't an option. We told him to suck it up, to not let one girl poison the entire evening for the rest of us. A few tense, silent minutes later, his phone lit up his face with a pale, sickly glow. "Dude, she's gone," he whispered, "her whole profile. It just disappeared." It took us a moment to process. Then the grim reality settled in. Bryson broke the news with his typical bluntness. "You got blocked, man." The implication was clear. Callista had likely found someone else to go to the party with and had cut him loose in the most surgically clean way possible. Ian slumped back into his seat, a dark cloud of teenage melodrama enveloping him for the remainder of the drive. He was a pouting, heartbroken ghost in the back seat. When we finally arrived at the address, all of Ian's drama was momentarily forgotten. The house was a monolith. It dwarfed every other home on the dimly lit street. A modern architectural marvel of glass and dark wood that seemed to absorb the twilight. It was the kind of house you saw in magazines, not in a random forgotten suburb. Our collective optimism surged. This was the real deal. Ian, however, was still mired in his own misery. He refused to go in just yet, claiming he needed to build up a significant buzz to face the potential social awkwardness of seeing Callista with another guy. None of us were in a position to object to some pre-gaming. Chris, ever the patient chauffeur, parked the car a little further down the block, and we cracked open the warm beers we had brought. Leaning against the cool metal of the car, we watched as a steady stream of people flowed into the house. It was a parade of silhouettes against the bright windows, and the low, muffled thrum of music promised exactly the kind of night we had been craving. Once Ian declared himself sufficiently buzzed, a state he reached after chugging 3 beers. In quick succession, we made our way toward the source of the sound and light. The moment we stepped across the threshold, a strange, discordant feeling washed over me. It was like stepping into a different dimension that was only pretending to be a party. The first jarring detail was the lighting. Every single overhead light was blazing at full intensity. There was no soft ambient glow, no colored mood lighting, just a sterile, almost clinical brightness that exposed every corner of the vast open-plan living room. It felt less like a party and more like an open house or a modern art gallery than there were the people. They were all impeccably dressed. Men in crisp button-down shirts and tailored trousers, women in elegant dresses and expensive-looking jewelry. It was a far cry from the jeans and hoodies we were sporting. We weren't just underdressed, we felt like a different species entirely. This wasn't a rowdy college blowout. It was a sophisticated, formal gathering. The kind we would never, under any circumstances, be invited to. And the music, it was the strangest part of all. There was no trap, no hip-hop, no pulsing EDM. Instead, the air was filled with a bizarre ethereal melody. It was instrumental, a complex tapestry of sounds that seemed to float and shimmer, creating a dreamy, almost drug-like atmosphere. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was profoundly odd, devoid of any rhythm you could actually dance to. It was the soundtrack to a strange dream. My friends and I exchanged bewildered glances, a silent conversation passing between us. What in the absolute hell is this? We turned on Ian, drilling him for any details he might have omitted, but his face was a mask of genuine confusion. He was as clueless as we were. Deciding to make the best of a deeply weird situation, we navigated through the clusters of well-dressed guests. There was alcohol in abundance, gleaming bottles of high-end liquor arranged on every available surface. We helped ourselves. The familiar burn of whiskey, a small anchor in the sea of strangeness. As I nursed my drink, I started to notice something else. People were looking at us. Not in a friendly, welcoming way, but with quick, furtive glances. Their eyes would catch mine for a fraction of a second before darting away, as if they had been caught staring. It was so consistent and so widespread that I began to feel a paranoid prickle on my skin. Was there something on my face? Was our attire so offensive that it warranted this level of silent scrutiny? I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just our own insecurity projecting. But the feeling of being watched, judged, and dismissed was inescapable. Despite the thick, unnerving atmosphere, the alcohol was working its magic. We were actually starting to have a bizarrely good time, laughing at our own awkwardness. Chris, however, was not. Utterly sober and immune to our forced merriment, he quickly grew bored. After about an hour, he announced he was going back to his car to smoke and listen to a podcast. We didn't blame him, this was hardly his scene. Minutes after Chris departed, our fortunes seemed to take a dramatic turn. A group of 3 girls materialized in front of us as if summoned from the ethereal music itself. In a place where we felt like lepers, being approached was a event for our collective confidence. They were immediately, almost aggressively, flirty. It wasn't subtle or coy. It was a direct, practiced assault of charm. One of them, a girl with sharp, intelligent eyes who introduced herself as Tina, joked about an entrance fee. I laughed, thinking it was a clever line, until I saw the dead seriousness in her expression. They produced a bottle of high-end tequila, holding it out like a sacred offering. We weren't about to turn that down. Without a second thought, driven by a cocktail of alcohol and a desperate need to not appear uncool, we each took a long, burning swig from the bottle. From that point on, the 6 of us became an inseparable unit. We drank, we talked, we even attempted a strange swaying dance to the formless music. It was going incredibly well, almost too well. At some point, while leaning in to hear something Tina was saying, I noticed it, a mark on her neck, just below her ear. It was a short, solid, straight line of the most vivid, unnatural green. It looked as if it had been drawn on with a fine-tipped Sharpie. It was so thin, so precise, that I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't been standing so close. I had an immediate, impulsive urge to ask her about it, but I bit my tongue. What if it was a birthmark, a tattoo? I didn't want to risk offending her and shattering this fragile, perfect moment. But once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it, or see it was just so green. What kind of makeup was that color? It wasn't a smear. It was a deliberate, perfect line. I forced myself to let it go, focusing on her words, on the possibility of where the night might lead. My hopes seemed to be materializing. I saw Bryson and the girl he was with break away from our small group, their hands clasped, and begin to wander up the massive floating staircase that dominated one side of the room. A few minutes later, Ian and his new companion followed suit. The message was clear. I was alone with Tina, the air thick with unspoken suggestion. But the alcohol, instead of bolstering my courage, was now fueling a rising tide of anxiety. My palms grew sweaty, my heart hammered against my ribs. I was terrified of saying the wrong thing, of messing it up. I mumbled an excuse about needing the bathroom and promised I'd be right back, needing a moment to compose myself. The only bathroom I could find on the ground floor was occupied. I stood outside the door, shifting my weight from foot to foot, my mind racing. Finally, the door swung open. A man stepped out, incredibly tall and older than most of the guests, dressed in a white linen shirt and matching pants. He looked like he owned the place. As I rushed to get past him, he shifted, and we bumped shoulders. I turned, expecting a mumbled apology, but he just stood there staring. He didn't speak. He just looked at me with a completely blank, impassive expression, his eyes raking over me from head to toe, as if he was sizing up a piece of livestock. It was the most unnerving, unsettling stare I had ever received. I was about to ask him what his problem was when my eyes fell to his neck, and there it was, the same green line, identical in every single way to the one on Tina's neck. Same length, same thickness, same unnatural color. A cold dread, far more sobering than any amount of alcohol, washed over me. Against my better judgment, my fear manifested as aggression. "What's your problem, man?" I snapped. He just smirked, a slow, condescending curl of his lips, and shook his head slowly. "Who invited you?" he asked, his voice a low, smooth rumble. My mind went blank. The only name that came to me was the one that had started this whole mess. "Callista," I blurted out. He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound, and looked up at the ceiling for a moment as if consulting some invisible database. Then his eyes locked back onto mine. His smile completely vanished. His face was a cold, hard mask. In a voice that was barely a whisper but carried the weight of a threat, he repeated her name, "Callista." He then gestured vaguely with his hand, encompassing the entire party. "Do you see Callista here?" I didn't know how to respond. The question hung in the air, loaded with a meaning I couldn't decipher but knew was sinister. Panic seized me. I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed the bathroom door in his face, the sound echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence of my own mind. I leaned against it, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. What he said, the way he said it, and that goddamn green mark. It was all swirling in my head, a toxic cocktail of fear and confusion. A part of me regretted not pressing him further, not demanding answers, but a much larger part of me knew I had just narrowly escaped something terrible. I left the bathroom, my mission no longer about composing myself, but about finding my friends. I scanned the crowd, no longer seeing a party but a collection of potential threats. I walked past more people, and this time their stares felt different. They weren't just furtive glances. They were knowing, predatory. It was the look of a pack of wolves that has just realized a few sheep have wandered into their den. I didn't care. I had to find Bryson and Ian and drag them out of this nightmare. As I moved through the room, my eyes were drawn against my will to people's necks. I started looking for it, that thin green line, and to my mounting horror, I saw it again and again. On a woman laughing by the bar, on a man deep in conversation by the window. They were all identical. The same color, the same length, the same thickness. It was a brand, a uniform. It was freaky. Most people weren't marked, which was somehow even more terrifying. It created a clear, unspoken division in the room, the marked and the unmarked. And we were definitely unmarked. I made a beeline for the stairs, my panic growing with every step. I had to get to my friends. As I started to ascend, a wave of relief washed over me. Bryson and Ian were walking down, their faces flushed with success. I grabbed them both, urging them to follow me, and pulled them into an empty hallway away from the prying eyes of the crowd. I told them everything, the words tumbling out of my mouth in a rushed, panicked whisper. The guy in the hallway, the stairs, the identical green marks on everyone's necks. I told them we had to leave, now. They burst out laughing. They told me I was drunk, that I was just being paranoid. Bryson, with a smug grin, accused me of being jealous because they had both hooked up and I hadn't. "Where's your girl now?" I demanded, trying to find a crack in his smug facade. He told me she had instructed him to wait 20 minutes and then meet her back upstairs. Ian nodded in agreement. His girl had told him the exact same thing. There was no reasoning with them. They were riding the euphoric high of a successful hookup, their brains clouded by alcohol and hormones. I pleaded with them, told them to just follow me, that I would prove it to them. I would point out the people with the strange marks, but they wouldn't budge. They were anchored to the spot, dreaming of their impending second rendezvous, just as I was about to give up, to leave them to whatever fate awaited them upstairs. Ian turned his head to the side to laugh at something Bryson said, and I saw it. My blood ran cold. It was a thin, perfect line on his neck. Only this one wasn't green. It was red. I screamed, not a loud, piercing shriek, but a strangled, horrified gasp that was somehow more effective. It cut through their drunken haze and finally got their attention. My hand shaking, I reached out and tilted Bryson's head, and there, on his neck, was the same thin red line. Ian told me to relax, that it was probably just a makeup stain from the girl, but Bryson's face had gone pale. He was starting to believe me. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Bryson and I turned for the door, and this time, a terrified Ian scrambled to follow. As we pushed our way through the crowd towards the exit, it felt like every eye in the room was on us. The ethereal music seemed to swell, a mocking, triumphant crescendo. No one moved to stop us, but their collective silent stare was a physical force, pushing us out the door. We burst out into the cool night air and ran, not stopping until we reached the safety of Chris's car. We piled in, screaming at him to just drive, to get us as far away from that house as possible. As the car peeled away from the curb, both Eon's and Bryson's phones began to buzz incessantly. It was the girls. "Why did you leave? Where did you go? How could they have known?" They weren't anywhere near the door when we left. My friends, their hands trembling, blocked the numbers without replying. Everyone I tell this story to has their own wild theory, a cult, an art project, a bizarre prank. I don't know what it was, but when I got home that night and scrubbed my face in the bathroom, I saw something in the mirror that has haunted me ever since. On my own neck, so faint I almost missed it. was the beginning of a thin red line. It wasn't makeup. It wouldn't wash off. And over the next few days, I watched in silent, abject terror as it grew darker. A permanent reminder of the party we were never meant to attend and the entrance fee we unknowingly paid. I still don't know what it means, but some nights, I swear I can still hear that strange ethereal music drifting on the wind.